You know, ending a marriage is tough no matter where you are. But in the Philippines, well, it's a whole different ballgame. We're not just talking about a difficult process, we're talking about a genuine legal labyrinth. Today, we're going to try and navigate that maze together and figure out why untying the knot in the Philippines is one of the most complicated legal journeys in the world. Everything starts right here. This single sentence from the Philippine Constitution isn't just a nice idea. It's the absolute bedrock of the entire legal system surrounding marriage. It's the reason why the law goes to such extraordinary lengths to preserve the marital bond, sometimes against all odds. Right. So what actually happens when that supposedly inviolable bond, well, violates? What can couples do when they've hit the end of the line? Let's dive into the different paths people try to take and see where they really lead. Okay, let's start with the most common idea people have, especially Filipinos living overseas. They think, hey, I'll just get a divorce where I am, and that'll be that. But as you're about to see, the law has a pretty big surprise waiting for them. And that surprise is called the nationality rule. Basically, it means if you hold a Philippine passport, Philippine family law follows you around the globe like a shadow. It doesn't matter if you're in New York, Dubai, or Rome, you're still bound by the laws back home. And the courts are very serious about this. Let's look at a real-life case to see how this plays out. In Lavadia versus Luna, you had two Filipinos who got divorced in the Dominican Republic. The husband actually got remarried that very same day. But when the case reached the Philippine Supreme Court, the ruling was brutal. They said that foreign divorce was completely void because both of them were Filipino. And that meant, you guessed it, his second marriage was void too. So the takeaway here is crystal clear. If you have two Filipino citizens, getting a divorce abroad is, legally speaking, a dead end. It just won't be recognized in the Philippines, period. Okay, so if getting a divorce is off the table, what's plan B? Well, what if you could prove the marriage was never legitimate to begin with? This leads us down a completely different path, the idea of nullity. Now, this is where it gets interesting. In the Castillo case, a woman got remarried without ever formally nullifying her first marriage. Why? Because her first marriage was void from the get-go. They didn't even have a marriage license. So the big question for the court was, is her second marriage bigamous? Is she illegally married to two people at once? And you might be surprised by the answer. The court said no, but it all hinged on when this happened. You see, this case really shines a spotlight on a massive shift in Philippine law. Before 1988, under the old civil code, a marriage that was void from the start was basically considered to have never happened. You didn't need a court to say so. But then, on August 3, 1988, the family code kicked in and it changed everything. Now you absolutely must get a judicial declaration of nullity before you can remarry. If you don't, that second marriage is toast. That's why the timing in the Castillo case was so critical. All right, this brings us to the most famous and maybe the most misunderstood grounds for nullity in the Philippines, psychological incapacity. You hear this term thrown around all the time, but what on earth does it actually mean in the eyes of the law? Let me tell you, it's a lot more complicated than it sounds. The Lanto Cruz case is the perfect reality check. Here, the wife came to court with a whole laundry list of complaints: infidelity, emotional abandonment, lack of intimacy, stuff that sounds like a pretty clear-cut case, right? Wrong. The court basically said, look, these things point to a very difficult, stressful marriage, but they don't prove a pre-existing psychological disorder. The bar for this is incredibly high. In fact, to succeed, you have to prove three incredibly strict things, often called the Molina guidelines. First, the condition must be grave. We're talking a genuine, deep-seated inability to perform your marital duties. Second, it has to be antecedent, meaning it existed before you said I do. And third, it has to be incurable, not just medically, but in a legal or clinical sense. It's permanent. So let's break this down even simpler. Psychological incapacity is a real, profound psychological condition that makes a person incapable of being a spouse. It is not just refusing to do your duties or having irreconcilable differences or infidelity. It's not about being a bad person or having bad habits. It's about a genuine, pre-existing inability. We've seen just how hard it is to get out of a marriage. But what if your spouse just disappears, vanishes? It's a heartbreaking scenario. And the law actually has a very specific, unique key for this very specific lock. So, in the Tadeo Marias case, a woman's husband, a soldier, had been missing for years. She went to court to have him declared presumptively dead so she could claim his military benefits. But the court said no, and their reasoning was fascinating. They explained that a court declaration of presumptive death is only needed for one and only one reason. And here's the distinction the law makes. If your goal is to remarry, then yes, you absolutely need to go to court and get a final judgment declaring your missing spouse is presumed dead. That's the only way. But for basically any other purpose, like claiming insurance, benefits, or inheritance, you don't need a court order. The law itself creates a presumption of death after enough time has passed. It's all about your reason for asking. Okay, so we've pretty much established that breaking the actual marriage bond in the Philippines is next to impossible for many. But what about all the practical stuff that comes with a separation? Custody of the kids, who gets what property, financial support. The law does provide a pathway for that, even if the marriage certificate remains intact. And that pathway is called court-annexed family mediation. This is a mandatory process in family court cases. The whole point is to get the couple to sit down and work out the practical issues, like custody and support, in a peaceful way instead of fighting a long, ugly battle in front of a judge. The process itself is pretty straightforward. First, the judge orders the case to mediation. Then, the couple either chooses or gets assigned a trained mediator. They have an initial meeting to see if they can sort things out right away. If not, the mediator might meet with each person separately and confidentially. Those are called caucuses. In the end, one of two things happens. They reach an agreement that gets sent back to the judge for approval, or they don't, and the case heads back to court for a full-blown trial. Now, it's super important to know that mediation has its limits. There are some things that are completely off the table. You can't mediate the validity of the marriage itself or the grounds for legal separation. And crucially, cases that involve violence are not eligible. Those serious issues have to be decided by a judge, no exceptions. So, when you look at the big picture, even if the legal bond of marriage is incredibly tough to break, mediation gives families a vital tool. It provides a way to untangle their lives, to resolve the day-to-day conflicts, and to find a way to move forward. And all of this brings us back to that fundamental question we started with. The law is designed to protect marriage as an inviolable institution, but is forcing people to stay legally bound in broken, sometimes miserable relationships, truly upholding the sanctity of marriage? It's a huge, ongoing debate in the Philippines, and it's definitely far from over.